Well, I guess there are two ways to look at work. One of the things I think when people make mistakes, it tends to be because they think of their work as a career rather than a marriage. And there are two different frames to enter, a utilitarian mindset, or we might call an emotional and moral mindset. And if you enter your marriage, nobody would enter a marriage with a utilitarian mindset. Does this pass a cost-benefit analysis test? Am I getting more out of it than I'm putting in? You don't enter a marriage that way. And in my view, you shouldn't enter a career that way either. You should enter a career with the question, who can I serve? What am I pouring my love into? Am I all in?
Right.
And that's what turns a career into a vocation. And the way you pick that is, I think you got to trick yourself, because when you're pouring yourself into a vocation, it's a long period of time. And I'm going to talk about this later in my next speech, but it's very hard to choose what to do. And so Nietzsche says what you should do when you're trying to choose a vocation is pick the 4 happiest moments in your life, see if they line up in any direction. And that way you figure out what you love. It's actually very hard to know what you love. Another thing I think is a good question is, what pains are you willing to endure? Every profession involves a certain sort of pain. Which ones are you willing to endure? Med school involves a sort of pain. Boot camp involves a sort of pain. I'm sure even being a right-wing think tank director involves some kind of pain.
There's plenty of pain.
Another good question, I think, is what would you do if you weren't afraid? I find fear is a super good GPS director of where you want to go, even if there are social obstacles in the way. I have a friend who was in a job interview, and he turned around to the woman who was actually interviewing him for a job, and he said, "What would you do if you weren't afraid?" And she broke down crying because she'd quit if she weren't afraid. And I always ask my students at Yale this, and a woman said to me, "I'd leave Yale tomorrow if I weren't afraid." And so I think fear is just a super good instigator. But again, we should, when we get married, we have a ceremony at a church or synagogue or mosque or something, and we make sacred vows. We should have a marriage ceremony for our vocation. And so are you self-consciously saying, okay, this is going to be something I'm really going to pour my love into? And I think the paradox, if you look at a job as something, I'm going to get a lot out of it, it'll be useful for me, you'll end up making yourself less happy and less successful than if you regard it in non-cost benefit terms.